From Maine to New Mexico, Arkansas to Oregon, Civic Network Television is lighting up America. CNT, linking America's communities to each other and the future. Live from Washington, D.C., Civic Network Television brings you Mobilizing Community Assets.
Let's review where we've been. We have looked at three basic community assets. The first is the gifts and capacities of individuals. The second is the central asset that takes individual capacities and magnifies them, and that's associations of citizens, where people are acting as citizens, not for pay. And the third is local institutions, where people are paid for their work, but if they are community-serving institutions, we have learned that what they do is they operate as support for community and are under control of the community. Now, we want today to try to cover three more vital topics if we're going to be able to understand, I think, the whole picture. The first thing we want to review is the nature of a local neighborhood economy, because throughout all of these relationships, there are dollars. There is a flow of money. We want to look at how the money can be understood as an asset in the locality. Then the second thing we want to ask is, well, if we understand these three assets and the economy that underlays it, then how do we develop a working community plan that integrates all of these, multiplies all of them, so the community can grow and grow in its own vision? And then finally, we want to think for a while about how outside institutions, perhaps that have money, are going to be able to support rather than direct, build rather than command local communities. So those are the three topics we want to address today. And we're going to start with the neighborhood economy. So Joe, why don't you start us off?
Well, let me start, John, by just saying a couple of things about what it is we mean by a neighborhood economy, because I think a neighborhood is not usually the place that people think about sort of economic realities. We think about national economies, or sometimes regional economies, sometimes international economies, particularly these days. But I think what we want to remind each other of tonight is that, in fact, there is something like a community economy, where, in fact, the dollars come into communities and then begin to circulate. In lots of the communities we've been working in, the problem is that the dollars come in and they leave immediately. They don't multiply. But here we have a community where, in fact, when Al gets his paycheck, what happens immediately is that he hires his neighbor Bob to fix his roof, right? So Bob gets a little bit of the action. And then what happens next is that Bob buys his nails at Dorothy's Hardware down the block, and the dollar does another piece of work in the neighborhood. And then Dorothy takes her family to Luigi's, another neighbor, for pizza, so that the dollar does another piece of work in the neighborhood. After that, Luigi pays Stan's scavenger service to clean up the empty pizza boxes out of the alley. And then finally, I think Stan's scavenger service hires Al's daughter, Cookie, to keep the books. So this is a little graphic done by some friends of ours about an old Italian neighborhood where, in fact, the dollar doesn't come in and leave, be spent elsewhere, but it circulates and it multiplies, and it has effects on multiple families and multiple businesses and workers in that neighborhood. And I think that that's the kind of neighborhood, the understanding of the neighborhood economy that we want to be talking about here. So that when we're thinking about the economy, we're thinking then about how do you see everything that is in this neighborhood through economic lenses, and start thinking about the income of the individuals and their potential to spend that income in the neighborhood, the clout of the combined citizens associations, and the economic impact of the local institutions. So we want to walk back through this map, this time thinking about dollar signs all the way through it for a little while. John, do you want to do that? Start us out with the individuals and associations once again?
Great. When we think about individuals, you'll remember that we were also saying that you could inventory the gifts and the skills and the capacities of individuals, and there is in the guide a tool, a capacity inventory. And that capacity inventory has been used economically in two ways. To interview individuals to find out about what kinds of skills and abilities they have. There's a wonderful list of all kinds of skills and abilities. And any of those potentially can be contributed to the community, but they can also be the basis for people to begin to enter the market, to sell their skills and abilities. And incidentally, if you have a clear idea of all the skills of people in a neighborhood and what they might represent economically, then we think what begins to happen is people see that they need to have a community connection system, like a brokerage operation, where we are understanding who needs what and who would be interested in paying for it. So that's how a capacity inventory of an individual's skills can be used to build the economy. Another thing that the capacity inventory demonstrates about individuals is that we can ask them about their experience or their interest in terms of enterprise. We can ask people in the neighborhood, have you ever thought of starting a business? If you have, what was it? And then a critical question, but if you haven't done it, why? And so another kind of community building initiative is to answer the why. What was in the way? So community development at the most basic level in terms of the economy is often getting the barriers out of the way of people with an enterprising idea. Now, there are other people in the neighborhood who can be inventoried who are selling something, making something. So they've entered the market. They're just an individual. But there the question is, what would help you to sell more to more people? And there, community economic development means the assistance necessary to broaden that person's participation in the market. So we can inventory skills and enterprise experience. And then we can inventory a third thing that individuals have, and that is that people spend money. And we have seen in several communities how there has been an effort to ask people in the neighborhood, what do you buy? And can you tell us in general how much you spend on that and where do you buy it? That information is critical information for people who want to start new enterprises. For instance, in Chicago, we know that in a public housing residence, such an inventory was done, and they found out that the people there buy enough children's clothing to actually support 2 children's clothing stores, but unfortunately they weren't in the neighborhood, so people were going long distances in order to buy their clothes. So it's an opportunity that can be inventoried in terms of the expenditures of individuals. So that's how the economy can be understood in terms of the gifts of individuals. Now, how can associations connect to the local economy? If you'll look in Building Communities from the Inside Out, on pages 361 through 366, you'll see the description of a neighborhood investment trust. And this is the design for a group of associations to begin to take the leadership in their neighborhoods for the development of a local investment fund, so that the churches and the clubs and the organizations each begin to contribute some money to an economic development fund, and when they contribute, they sit on the board. And then they turn to the United Way, or they turn to foundations, and they say, well, you invest too. And then you begin to build a pool in which people from the associations in the community are coming together and saying, now we have an investment possibility. How should we invest our resources to build the economy of our community? It's a wonderful opportunity, and I hope that throughout the country people will look at that section and see whether it might illuminate a possibility for generating a local economy in new ways through associations. Now, the other way of building a local economy is obviously through the local institutions.
And we should say at least a word about that, because it seems to us that if the principle is still going to be followed, that you start in all community building activities by looking at what's already there, right, and seeing what you've got, and that our constant finding is that when you do that, when you change the glasses to see what we've got, there's always more there than you think. One of the clear ways that we're discovering that this is true is when people take another look at the institutions that are already in their neighborhood. I'm not talking now about institutions that are usually thought about as economic, right? I'm talking about parks and schools and libraries and police and all of the sort of normal institutions that don't usually get thought about in terms of their economic power. But if you think about them in economic terms, all of a sudden you've got a whole new set of resources. A little graphic that illustrates a few of the possibilities for mobilizing and using the economic resources of non-economic institutions, right? We think about schools as places that educate children. We think about parks as places that do recreation, and police provide protection. Let's think about them in terms of their economic functions and their economic potential. And this is simply the beginning of a list. We are now finding that if you look in your institutional base in every community, that all of our institutions buy a lot of stuff. Right? Think of all the stuff that a school buys and the police department buys. If you started saying which of those kinds of items for purchase could be purchased locally, right? What do we already have in the community in terms of businesses that could sell to the institutions in our neighborhood? They don't have to go hundreds of miles away. They don't even have to go to another neighborhood to buy a lot of what they're already buying. They hire people. All of our institutions hire people, and we're finding, in fact, that an awful lot of the work that institutions do could be done by local people, that there are lots of skills, that if you began to do a skills bank and match them with local institutional needs, you'd find an awful lot of folks who, in fact, could do some of the work locally. Creating new businesses. Do you remember in the first program we talked a little bit about Lucy Flower High School, about that high school, that wonderful high school that was creating businesses for their young people to begin to experience the world of business and make money at the same time? Well, one of the things that they did was they asked themselves, what are we buying? And if we can't buy it in the neighborhood, why don't we start a business that allows us to purchase from the business? So there's all kinds of business startup possibilities if we look at what our local institutions already buy. Again, in Lucy Flower, we saw a wonderful example of sort of the institution developing the human capacity, so that those young people, remember the young man working in the shop who was thinking already of himself as an accountant, right? He had his future all mapped out, right? And he knew exactly where he was going because that sort of opportunity was there for him. We're seeing service learning projects coming up throughout the United States. We're seeing the kinds of things, Barbara, that you're involved with young people doing all kinds of work in businesses and in community groups and sort of preparing themselves for the world of work. Lots of communities have institutions that have an interest in developing the physical resources of the neighborhood, right? When you think about, in a lot of our neighborhoods, all of the abandoned buildings, all of the vacant land, all of the dilapidated infrastructure, right? One of the major sets of opportunities is to say, what can we do with that? What can we do with those physical resources to turn them around, to make them productive once again, to do community gardens and farms, to turn the transit stations into opportunities for development? So that's being done by communities across the United States. And then everybody who runs an institution in a local neighborhood has usually, at some points in their cycle of yearly financing, some money to invest. What if they would do that all locally, right? In the local Nations Bank, or in the local credit union, or in the local vehicle, which in fact is a local investment kind of vehicle. And what if, in fact, if you don't have a local investment vehicle, those institutions would get together and begin to form one, begin to think about what would you need to make credit flow into this neighborhood once again. And then finally, every institution in the neighborhood, or many of them, particularly public institutions, have relationships with downtown or with places that are bigger than they are, right? And they can be bridges to those resources. They can allow the neighborhood to be able to think in broader terms about the resources that can be coming into this neighborhood. So they are valuable as sort of ways to contact and make relationships with the outside world. And we'll be talking about those kinds of relationships a lot more later on in this program. So that's just a beginning list of what institutions can do. Now, the other thing you'll find in the Green Book, in the guide, on pages 293 to 310, is a little section that in fact talks about the kinds of institutions that provide in a community the lifeblood that credit represents. If you can't borrow in a community, if nobody's investing in that community, you don't have the financial wherewithal to do a lot of the things that the community wants to do. So we've been particularly interested in the CDFIs, the Community Development Financial Institutions, that have a direct kind of control and sight in the neighborhoods. We've been particularly interested in the small ones, like the Community Development Credit Union movement, and all of the tools that puts in people's hands to get credit back into their neighborhoods. So that, too, is a really important part of what building a community economy is about. Now, there's so much more to be said about the economy, and we just don't have the time tonight to do it. But I thought it would be good to sort of end this segment by listening to one of the people from whom we've learned an awful lot about how to think creatively about the community economy. You remember we've visited before the west side of Chicago and Bethel New Life, and you know about their work. Let's listen for just a moment to one of the most creative economic development voices in communities in America. This is the president of Bethel New Life, Mary Nelson, talking about the way in which she sort of approaches this idea of economic development and some of the tactics that they've tried. Here's Mary.
Bethel sort of evolved in looking at the assets of the community, and obviously geographically there's some interesting ones. But most importantly, when we began to look at the assets of the community, we saw two things. One is that we are right next to the city's incinerator plant, and there's a lot of fly dumping going around here, so there's a lot of garbage in this community. And we saw then that garbage could be a real asset, and began to get into recycling and in the environmental kinds of things in terms of looking for ways to develop jobs in the community. And the other asset was a lot of elderly people. And with the graying of America and the service economy kind of notion, services to elderly then, because we have a lot of good caregivers in this community, a lot of people who've been already caring for their neighbors and their grandmas and their aunties and so forth, and who could then be about this business of caring for the elderly on a cost-effective basis. So those are the two sort of other kinds of assets that we discovered as we were looking for ways to build jobs in the community. So we've begun marketing the vacant industrial land around here to companies that are in recycling, remanufacturing, and the one I love to talk about is the one that may be coming in very soon. They've made a commitment, and they take old diapers, baby diapers, and they wash them, the disposable kind. They wash them and they take the plastic off, and what's left is a pulp that's a really good pulp and cost-effective pulp for high-grade paper. A good example, but a whole variety of kinds of recycling, remanufacturing companies. So you walk down a road and you don't know where it's going to lead you, but this has the prospect now of 400 new jobs in our community and of a career ladder in the environmental careers that really does lead to livable wage jobs.
So there's Mary Nelson talking about, I think, the wonderfully creative process that they've engaged in of finding, where nobody else saw them, a whole set of economic development assets, right? What did she list? She listed vacant land, she listed diapers, she listed all of the older folks in the community. All of those things then are thought about as economic development materials, and I think she does a wonderful job at that.
We're now at the place where we want to think about how you can put all three pieces together with the economy underneath so that we have a whole community plan being developed. And in order for us to be able to do that, I think there are two cautions. And the first is, not every community, I think, is ready or should start by saying, we'll put it all together. We'll get all our assets and get them in line. In many communities, I think the thing we need to do is extend what we're already doing, but to begin to move away from needs and move toward assets. A second caution is that developing a whole community plan means you're serious about involving everybody, but you're also serious through time. This is not something that you're going to do in 2 years. Community development that is asset-based is serious business, and it's a decade. It's a 2-decade. In fact, it is a continuing process. So with those cautions, let's move ahead and think about how we can put these pieces together.
I do think also we should say at the beginning that as we're sort of talking a little bit about each of these 5 steps, it occurs to us that when we see them actually happening in communities, they're all happening at once. That is, none of them are steps that you do once, it's done, and you move on then and do some. So those of us with linear and sequential minds are always in trouble, right, in these community processes. We have to get more circular about our processes. But I think where we want to start is to take just a moment and to say that the critical first step, if you're going to do long-term, serious community planning, is to think about what we've been calling the table and setting the table. John, is there a table here?
There is.
We're going to set the table for a moment. And what we're going to suggest is that it is very important in the community planning process to think about who's at the table in the inner circle and who's sort of involved and very important, but kind of at one remove in an outer circle. And I think what we want to suggest, and we see it in our friends in Dudley Street and Roxbury, and we see it in a number of other stories that we'll be telling in a moment, that the critical elements of the community planning process are the associations, are the places where citizen power and energy comes together without getting paid. So it's the churches, it's the block clubs, it's the athletic teams and leagues, right? It's the cultural groups, it's the places where folks are coming together to do the work together of community building, as de Tocqueville reminded us years and decades ago. It's those groups that we need at the center of our process, right? We also need the institutions, the triangles there, but they're at the outer ring at this point because those systems and institutions, and we all have one foot in them too, right? Because they are so powerful and because they have so many resources, if they come to the table first, what we find over and over again is that their own institutional agendas will begin to dominate what gets talked about at the community table. So it's so important to emphasize that the circles go around the table. I want to spend just a moment now on the building of the table. And I've asked our colleagues here in the studio to think a little bit about their own neighborhoods and to suggest very briefly one citizens association in their neighborhood that they would be absolutely clear had to be at the table. If this is a serious neighborhood planning table that you were setting, who has to be there from your neighborhood? Let's just start and we'll collect them. And John, you can put them up there.
Well, the community action group associated with my church provides training and job opportunities for homeless people and the people with addictions.
Okay, so they bring all kinds of interest in the housing questions and and a variety of citizens' approaches to the agencies and services. Great. Okay.
In my neighborhood, we have a very strong neighborhood association called the CNT Park Neighborhood Association.
Yes, and if there's an association already there, they've got to be at the center of this process. Dr. Mays?
Well, I think it's imperative to include our local PTA council at the table because they're concerned with youth and their education.
Absolutely, and it's the parents' voice, and the parents' voice needs to be at the table.
Again, getting back to economics, your local chambers of commerce bring kind of that perspective and cover the business assets and resources.
So the associations of businesses, the tables that the businesses come together and think about their role in the community. Terrific, absolutely.
I think you need youth and fraternities there.
You bet. We need the strong youth voice. We've seen it in Dudley Street. It's one place, but all over the place. Where there's a strong youth voice, there's a lot more life at that table. Absolutely, Bernard. Thanks.
Because our group would deal with the issue of safety, I think we definitely need a neighborhood watch group.
A neighborhood watch group, absolutely. And probably more than one. All of them we can find, because clearly safety is important. Absolutely.
As well as a recreational type of group like a softball league.
Absolutely. Yeah. Communities are places where people play, as well as work. Absolutely. We need those folks at the table. Barbara?
I think one of the active groups are Boys and Girl Scout troops, which involve the parents and the youth. They're very active in this organization.
Terrific. Terrific. Well, we've got a list then here of 8 various citizens associations, all of whom bring a different lens to their community building activity to the table. And I can't imagine a table that doesn't have all 8 of those around it and can't build, therefore, a kind of holistic idea about where we're going in this community. We're also then probably going to want to have some institutions around. We're going to want to have the schools there. We're going to want to have the police there. Talk about neighborhood safety. We're going to want to have the businesses themselves there. We're going to want to have the parks and the libraries. But you see that the discussion needs to start and be centered and be driven by the citizens' voices. And that those institutional voices, those triangles, are so important to have there, but to have there as responsive sets of resources. The treasure chest, right? It's the circles that will open up the treasure chests and ask them to contribute to the community building process. So that's the kind of table we've got. Once you've got a table like that, it's time then to think about what can this table do, logically enough. Oh, John, do you want to help us start thinking about what this table does?
Right. It goes right to the map. And it begins the business of identifying all of the individual capacities, all of the associational assets, and all of the institutional assets, so that its initial business is sort of mining the territory, is making sure of every asset that is there. And as that happens, right, it will expand the table because they will find more and more associations. And it will probably expand the institutional table. So this will build the table. Secondly, it will make clear that where we're focused is on assets and not needs and deficits, so that everybody at the table will have that experience. And finally, and we think this is really very important, that when the table, the associations, the people who are involved in community planning are doing an asset inventory, if at all possible, they should do it themselves. They should not have some outsider do it, because every time you go door to door and you ask your neighbor about their skills or their entrepreneurial experience, every time you go and try to talk with the leaders of other associations, you're building a relationship, a new kind of relationship. You're not going and saying to somebody, I wonder if you can't read. You're not asking them negative questions, you're asking them affirmative questions. And so you build a community's relationships by this kind of inventory of assets if the key people who are sitting at the table are directly involved and their associations are involved as well. And so that leads us to the third point.
Which is simply, I think, something that lots of you in the audience, I'll bet, have had some experience with, and it is to build a vision. Without a vision, the people perish. Where is that in the Old Testament, right? It's clear that the community that has come together at the table with the broadest representation possible and built together their sense of where we want to be in 2010. How can I imagine this community for my children and my grandchildren? What do we want? Not just a physical sense, not just a sense of what we want it to look like, but what kind of social relations do we want here? What are we talking about in terms of an economy? What is our vision together? And people who have worked hard at that, and there are all kinds of techniques for doing it that we won't go into tonight, know that that vision can drive a process and can keep people coming back to the table on a positive note, not just because they want to stop something, but because now we know. Now we know what we believe in and where we're going. Once we have a vision then, John, and the table set, what do we do next?
Well, next we take the fourth step. And if this is where the vision would lead us, and this is where we are now, what we have seen as the critical process now is that all the associations come together and they say each, what can we do to make that vision come real? What can the softball league do to raise money for our plan for the parks that we are going to create in the community, right? What can the softball league do to begin to bring young people in to be connected and engaged with adults? And what will the softball league do to maintain the land and clear it when we're done? So what happens is when you add up all of the contributions of the associations, is you find you've gotten this far. And then you realize that you have your institutions, right? And they are all treasure chests. So you go and you check out each treasure chest and say, what is the institution going to do to get us to our vision? What is the school going to contribute? What is the hospital going to contribute? What is the community college going to contribute? And we know that what you will find is that when you take the associational assets and the institutional assets and you add them up, you're almost there, but you won't be there. Because now you're to the fifth point, and that is you're going to have to get something from outside. Right? And Dudley Street has been a wonderful example of what happens when you really mobilize and commit your local associations and institutions. Then you'll know what you need to get to your goal, and what they know they needed was control over their land. They had a wonderful plan, but they didn't control the land. It was owned by slum landlords, and some of it was in courts, and the city had some. So they persuaded the city of Boston to give them the power of eminent domain, and that made their vision a possible reality. So that's the way we think that you can take the fourth and the fifth step.
John, as long as you're mentioning the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, we just want to say that if you want to really look at this process of a powerful neighborhood planning effort, that looking at the book called Streets of Hope, The Fall and Rise of an Urban Neighborhood by Peter Medoff and Holly Sklar, is one way to really get a sense of the Dudley Street story. That's the story of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, and it's a wonderful read for anybody who's interested in community building. I wish we had the time to tell that full story, but read the book. But the story we do want to leave you with in this section, how does all this stuff work out in a single place? We've got a little clip we'd like you to look at from a city called Monroe, Louisiana, where folks who, in fact, had never talked with each other for hundreds of years got together in a kind of powerful community planning process that excited us and from which we learned an awful lot. It happened to be the process that was called for by the legislation that enacted the empowerment zone. So here's a story from Monroe, Louisiana, about how their citizens got together to do a neighborhood plan.
Ouachita Parish, a small community in northeast Louisiana, yet the largest urban area in the impoverished Mississippi Delta. To some, this may appear to be just an old abandoned building on Monroe's south side. To others, it's a vision of hope. Some may think of her as just a disadvantaged youth growing up in a single-parent household. She imagines herself as a college graduate. Poverty and other social ills threaten the economic growth of a community and can destroy the dreams of those who live among them. In Ouachita Parish, with a population of 142,000, some 40,000 people live in poverty. According to the last census, Monroe is ranked as the third poorest city in the nation, with a poverty rate of 37.8%, more than twice the national rate. These staggering statistics made community and business leaders and government officials from Ouachita Parish, Monroe, and West Monroe realize that a change needed to occur. They looked beyond the numbers and saw the community itself, the people living there, their hopes and their dreams. Together, these leaders and residents can empower each other to use all their resources to reclaim their community, their goals, their dreams. They began to come together in the neighborhoods. Approximately 600 residents attending 11 neighborhood meetings identified their strengths and their greatest ambitions for their community.
We're working together and we're actually motivated from the inside. It's not something that we're doing because we have to do it. We're doing it because we want to, and that's the difference that makes the difference.
This process is introduced us to more people, a more diverse group of people. There's a lot of energy, and I don't think it's do anything but just explode and be better for us.
Business leaders, along with neighborhood residents, assembled at Northeast Louisiana University's Ewing Coliseum to develop a vision for Ouachita Parish. This was part of the strategic planning process, which forged new partnerships. Almost 400 people, black, white, employed, unemployed, young, and old, visualized our community in the year 2004. The wisdom of age, the vigor of youth, and the knowledge of the learned helped to reduce hundreds of ideas to 9 targeted cluster areas, building safe and caring neighborhoods, creating quality, diverse jobs, developing market-driven education, expanding community-based business ownership by zone residents, creating innovative and accessible wellness systems, improving home ownership opportunities, improving and coordinating transportation and communication infrastructure, improving the physical community condition, and developing the downtown and river area for tourism.
I think what we saw today was an historic event for Monroe. We brought blacks and whites together. We brought old and young. We brought Christians and Muslims and Jews. And we brought unemployed people. We brought employed people. We brought people who have more than one job to support their family. We brought people who don't have jobs who support their family together today to come and reach a common vision of what Ouachita Parish is all about for the future. We've never done that in this community. This community is hundreds of years old, and this is something that I think will carry us forward for hundreds of more years, but it's certainly in the next decade, and we have a lot of work to do.
We've learned that we're friends, and I think that's the most valuable aspect here. The railroad track doesn't have to be a dividing line, just a passageway to get from one neighborhood to the other.
Citizens met for several weeks to carve out the strategies for achieving the vision of these 9 areas. 27 projects emerged as the basis for the community's strategic plan. The vision becomes more potent with the commitments of not only the residents, but the business community and the 3 neighboring institutions of higher learning, Northeast Louisiana University, bordering the zone, as well as sister universities, Grambling State and Louisiana Tech, have come together in an unprecedented joint effort. The strength of our vision will truly lie with the people of the neighborhoods, working together with business, human service, and government leaders to build a stronger community. That's why thousands of people put in writing their commitment to make this community a better place. They signed the Ouachita Pact, stating their volunteer community service. Their crusade became known as Back the Pact.
I want to regain the strength of our community and provide positive outlets for our youth. That's why I back the pact.
What? Seeing businesses expand to create more jobs. That's why I back the pact.
More minorities to own their own businesses. That is the reason why I back the pact.
What does it mean, back the pact?
That's your written promise to help improve this community. Whether it's tutoring at-risk children, planting a flower bed, providing more jobs. Support this community. Back the pact.
This is a community that has learned to build on its strengths. The enormous investment of thousands of citizens in Ouachita Parish has forged new relationships and means our community will never be the same. Change is gradual, but change is constant. What the people of Ouachita Parish have discovered is change is empowering.
So there we have one incredibly exciting story, it seems to me, of a community that has really gotten into a kind of a new life, if you will. I think there's an energy in Monroe that you feel there, that they've in fact mobilized all of their assets, and they really are. They got an enterprise community designation, and they're moving forward. The idea of the Back the Pact movement, it seems to me, is one that communities all over the country might begin to adapt. What is it that people could actually sign that says, here's what I'm going to contribute to my community over the next decade? It's a wonderful example that we've learned a lot from.